thank you for taking the time to be with us at C3. We hope you enjoy today's message.
Which is a great segue into this morning, Alive Again, as we are looking at kind of a mini-series on just the resurrection and what it really means and why it's important, why we should understand it. And we're going to spend just a couple of weeks looking into it. How many people have noticed that lately a lot of stuff in the movies and TV have to do with like death and the afterlife and coming back to life? If you're watching the highlights for the Avengers over the last few years, the Age of Ultron with the robotic age and a guy coming and going, okay, we have to get rid of humanity because they've totally screwed this up. And so the robots are going to take it over. And then there is this creature, this guy who's known as Thantos, who is this guy who feels that the best way to do this is to wipe out half of humanity. Now, where do you think that they come up with that? And start all over. And so all of these people just randomly are just going to be eliminated. And then we have the end game, which is how they come back to life, to bring the things that were kind of blown away in the wind back to life. Kind of a pseudo-resurrection type theme. Right? And so what we're going to take a look at is, what did people mean in the early age of the church with this term resurrection? What did Paul want us to know, want the church to know about resurrection? Why is it important? And then more importantly, why don't we understand more about it? Because here's my question this morning. How many people have ever had anybody come up to you, or have you ever done this, and asked this question to a person? Or have been asked this question? If you were to die tonight, do you know where you would go? Now, the answer to that normally is what? Well, I'm either going to heaven or hell. But is that the correct answer? Paul would say to the church, not so fast, my friend. Because there is something in the whole biblical narrative that we have to understand about the concept of heaven, eternity, and how resurrection fits in that. And so we're going to take a look at that over the next couple of weeks and just explore a little bit. It's kind of more in an academic set, and then we'll take a look at how this concept of kingdom then works out in our life, and we'll jump into some aspects out of the Sermon on the Mount and what Jesus is looking at, and then move on throughout the remainder of the year, looking at, okay, well, how do we take this concept of resurrection, the thought process of it, and then implement this so that we don't become the kind of believers just follow the calendar, where we move towards Christmas, which is great. We do all the celebrating, all the presents opening, and we have all of our nativity scenes, and we welcome Jesus into the world, and we kind of talk a little bit about incarnation and what that means and what it looks like, and joy to the world, and we sing all the great songs, and it's just great because Jesus comes to bring peace on earth and goodwill toward men. Then you look out the window and go, it doesn't look so goodwillish and peaceful out there. And so it's better to kind of run in here. And then we move towards Easter, which is the culmination of the church calendar. And then on to Pentecost, where we kind of hoot and holler a lot about, yay, Easter is our day to celebrate. And we do the kind of pump them up kind of rah-rah thing. And then we have a day like today where everybody comes back in and you look like this. Where, okay, so what's next? And so thinking a lot about that, I've entitled this little series, Christ is Risen, so now what? What's the big deal? Because most of us would go, okay, we've stepped over the line, we've crossed over from this kingdom of the world, from death to life, we've invited Christ into our life, yay me, yay us. So when I die, and like the song said, when my time is up, I get to go someplace, heaven, and I have this blissful existence where I kind of see all the people that I've known, and then we have this great party, and then what? We don't really talk much about that. All we know is it's not like this, and it's promised that it's going to be better, but what actually are we doing? You know, and if you watch much TV or if you go to the movies a lot, it kind of has it as it's this like really great thing, and you really kind of have a lot to do with nothing, and you sit around and you sing all day, but there is no day because there's no time, and so you just keep singing. And then, you know, as somebody who doesn't go into singing, I'm like, that doesn't really like float my boat a whole lot. So what does eternity look like? The concept of eternity, resurrection, how are we to think? How is it supposed to act? So we're going to take a look at that. So obviously there's some things that we need to do first and foremost, and we're going to do that out of really the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 15. There's a whole chapter that Paul dedicates to this, to a church that was kind of messed up, kind of trying to muddle through and try to figure all this out, and kind of look at the book as a kind of a overarching concept of the resurrection. And then we're going to look at something Jesus said out of the Gospel of John. So if you have your Bibles, or if you may see this pop up on the screen here behind me, we're looking to look at the Gospel of John, chapter 11, verse 25. And our passage this morning, one of the things I think we need to look at as a starting point is, how do we define this? How do we define the resurrection? And what does Jesus say about the resurrection? And what does that look like? And so in the Gospel of John, chapter 11, verse 25, it's a very famous verse, one that most of us can quote. It's kind of a t-shirt type verse, kind of a mug type verse, bumper sticker type verse. You know, things that everybody looks at, but maybe doesn't quite understand. And Jesus makes a very profound statement. It's at a graveside. And the context of this is he was really good friends with a family, 2 sisters and a brother. And it was Mary and Martha. They lived in a town of Bethany, was just a kind of a stone's throw from Jerusalem. And he would stay there a lot. And Mary and Martha were very close. Well, they had a brother named Lazarus, and Lazarus and Jesus actually were pretty good friends. And we know the story that they send word he's sick, and Jesus, as being fully God, fully man, knows that there's something that has to happen here. And so because he likes Lazarus so much, he lets him die. And then he takes 4 days to get there, shows up, and everybody's brokenhearted, everybody's crying, and the whole gist of all of this is everybody says to him, if only you had been here, Lazarus wouldn't have died. So they recognize something about Jesus, is this guy's got unbelievable power and unbelievable ability to stop the worst thing that can happen to people, which is sickness and ultimately death. He can stop that, and he can reverse it. So he says then, in light of all of that, okay, hang on. He says to both Mary, to Martha, in different settings, he says this, that I am the resurrection and the life. Those 2 words, I am the resurrection, I am the life. Those 2 kind of fit together. And he says then that anyone who believes in me, so that faith and action kind of a thing, those who follow me, those who pattern their life after me, those who know that I am, those who understand that I am fully God, that I am the creator, that I have a plan, that I'm here kind of bringing the forward plan into time today, so that the whole narrative becomes really important, that you understand that I am both of these things, that I am the life that brings life presently, and I am the resurrection that does something that nobody really understood what it meant, because the resurrection, the concept of resurrection, nobody believed in during these days. So that one kind of went whoosh, right over everybody's head. And they kind of hone in on the life. Now, Judaism understands that there was a concept that at the end of time, God would kind of redo everything. And you hear Martha talk about that, and you hear Mary say, yeah, well, we understand that, you'll renew all things and you'll restore all things. But they weren't thinking in terms of the resurrection. They were thinking in terms of the whole kingdom of God. And so he says this, that even if you die, you're going to live. So kind of a hint here to them. And anyone who lives and believes in me will never, ever die. And then the question, do you believe this? So if you're Mary, if you're Martha, if you're anybody kind of walking around, if you're the apostles, disciples, or sitting here this morning and kind of put yourself in the little scene here, you would have to go, yeah, but he's already been dead. He is dead. And the one thing that we know about the dead, they stay dead. So, yeah, I believe, but haven't the faintest idea of what you're going to do. And then he speaks, and out comes Lazarus. Now, Lazarus is not resurrected. So that's something you have to understand. The resurrection is not that. Lazarus is just brought back into this life. He is kind of relifed, almost like just breath was put back in him. Lazarus is put back in his body and comes out. So everybody recognizes Lazarus. That's not resurrection. Okay, just so that you understand that. So then what is, if we were going to define it, let's pull out our friend Mr. Webster and see how he defines resurrection. And so the resurrection is simply defined very simply as this: the state of one risen from the dead. But that really doesn't help, right? So it's the state of one risen from the dead. Resurrection deals with a body, a physical body. That's why state is in there. When we see Jesus Christ at the resurrection on what has become known as Easter Sunday, he has a body that is both sort of, but not sort of recognizable. It fits in this world, but it can do things otherworldly. So he can walk through doors. He can be in one place and then in another place. So but it's a body. He eats. So we see him eat on the shoreline, makes breakfast, cooks, so speaks, all of that. So there's the state of one who is risen from the dead. The easiest way to understand this is what Jesus is talking about in John 11, and what we're trying to define is resurrection life, is life after death. So there's two states that Paul will make us aware of as we're going. Is there is life eternal, and then there's life after death. So the life after death, that question that we ask or have been asked, if you were to die today, do you know where you're going? And if you are a believer, the answer is yes, I know I'm going to heaven. Not really sure where it is, how it's located, whether it's around us, up above us and around us. We know it's not below us. There is this realm, this kingdom where God is present, where his rule is present, where he is present, that is full of light, all of that. We know we go there. The one thing that we do know for sure is we don't take our body there. So our body goes in the ground, or in today's culture, it gets burned up, or some other cultures, and then it is no more. It kind of goes back to its original molecular state, and then the spirit, the soul goes on. Don't really know much about what that is. It appears, from what we understand, that other spirit souls in that same condition are recognizable to other people. We get all of that, and so this whole issue of kind of this resurrection and what does it mean and what does it look like. But what Jesus is talking about as the resurrection is I'm going to be the first of this order, but I'm also the life, he's saying in John. And so from a biblical perspective, one of the things that you want to write down, or if you want to kind of make a note somewhere, is this, that Jesus wants everyone to know that life really flows from the Father through him into this world that's thirsty for this thing called what? Life, real life, authentic life. It doesn't want like fake life, right? We've all experienced fake life. If you win the lottery, you're going to have a blast until you find everybody that's won the lottery is usually bankrupt. And they're not so happy. And if they do win the lottery, guess what happens? They publish your name. That's the worst thing that could ever happen to somebody who wins $100 million if they publish your name. You got to change your phone. You got to move. You got to change your address. Everybody that has ever known you is looking for a piece of the lottery. Every organization is looking for a piece of you. That's not so authentic when you all of a sudden discover that I thought this would bring me peace, and the only thing that the lottery has brought me is misery. There aren't many stories out there of people who've won the lottery that are happy people. And they buy everything under the sun. People that have fame resent fame. Most people that are famous are incredibly insecure and hang on to it because they're afraid that it's going to be taken from them. And when you are famous, there's a whole group of a segment of our society called the media that has this disdain for fame. So they want to lift you up so they can tear you down so that they can become famous. So that this whole thing of authentic real life, a life that is full of peace, that has hope, that understands who they are and what they're here for. He said that all flows from my Father because he's the originator of this. He gives the blueprint of authentic life. The world doesn't know it, so I put on Jesus as flesh and blood to give you a glimpse of what authentic life looks like, or authentic humanness. So if you want to know what it's like to be, really human, you look at him. And so this whole issue then of life covers all facets. You read Jesus and you're going to find he has a lot to say about life. I bring you what kind of life? Abundant life. I can restore your life. I can renew your life. I can give you a blessed life. And all of the things that he talks about, so much of all of that is flowing from God through him and touches us, so that all that is in the abundancy and the blessing, and all of that gets kind of lived out with us, provided we really have a mind and a heart that is kind of open to it and we see it. Otherwise, we walk around as spiritually saved, and you can walk around as spiritually saved, but yet relationally broken. Relationally divisive. You can walk around spiritually saved and relatively worldly unloving. You can walk around this life spiritually saved, but feeling incredibly alone. So there's some things that happen with all of this that Jesus will say. So that kind of gives you the background of all of this. Now let's see what Paul does with this, because Paul's going to take this, he's going to talk to a church about the importance of the resurrection and why it's central to our belief. And if you don't understand it, then life becomes really, really muddled. And so it's not ironic. It's probably very God-ordained that he writes this to the church that's a mess. Okay? So let's take a look at 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And just see what he says, because he's been talking now for 14 chapters, and you kind of get the gist after you read if you've read the letter of 1 Corinthians. Corinth was a messed up group of people, they had all kind of issues that we're going to walk through a little bit and see what he's getting at here. But it's only like in chapter 15, he almost like takes a breath and goes, okay, let me just again remind you of what the gospel is. So that's our setting. So he says in beginning in verse 1, and I'll just read for a little bit. You can follow along, whatever translation you have. I'm going to read out of a very contemporary one just so that you kind of get the feeling of this. He says, let me remind you, brothers and sisters, friends, about the good news which I announced to you. The good news is what? The good news is the gospel. So let me remind you about that. Now, you received this good news and you were standing firm on it, and you are saved through it if you hold fast to the message I announced to you, unless it was for nothing that you believed. So he's saying, all right, let me just remind you that the good news, the gospel, is really important. Hang on to it, stand on it, don't stand on top of it, but just, really pattern your life around it. Grab hold of it, understand it, and then begin to live it. So he says in verse 3, what I handed on to you at the beginning, you see, was what I received, namely this, that the Messiah died for our sins in accordance with the Bible, Or in some of your translations, it will say in alignment or in accordance with the Scriptures. That Jesus Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Bible. Now, that whole aspect is important because it doesn't mean that we look at salvation and we pull out 2 or 3, maybe 4, maybe 5 proof texts to prove that he really did. He's saying, no. This is in alignment with the full counsel, the full narrative, if you will, of the Scriptures or of the entire Bible. So the whole biblical narrative is this, that Christ died for our sins, that this thing called salvation, the Messiah, reached the place where it was going from way back in creation when the serpent first deceived Eve and Adam. Now it's reached that point. So all of this happened in accordance with God's plan. The whole biblical narrative. You can go from Genesis to Exodus through Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Judges, all the way through Malachi, all the way through the Gospels, through the life of Jesus, to come to this place of the resurrection. He said, look, let me just so that you aware, this now has reached the place where God had wanted it to go. That salvation is now, sins are now forgiven. There is a retrospective, futuristic look at this moment that happens right smack dab in the middle of human history. It reached the place where it was going. So he said it's pretty important that you understand that. And that not only did he die, but he was buried and he was raised again on the 3rd day in accordance with the Scriptures. That this resurrection was also now has reached the place where God wanted it to go, from there, way over to there, and then back right to here. So there is something that happens with all of this. It was in accordance, and he goes on. And he said, now he was seen by Peter, then he was seen by the 12, then he was seen by over 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of who are still with us, but some have died. And then he was seen by James, then by all the apostles, and last of all, as to one ripped from the womb, he appeared to even me. And then he'll go on to talk about his little thing about, I'm kind of the least of all and all of that. But what he wants the church to know here, what he's been talking about all along, is that the gospel has reached this point. And so there's a way that we need to think about this. And if you were to go through the book of 1 Corinthians, we kind of tend to look at it as like he's fixing all of these mistakes, all these problems. Personalities in the church and marriage and sexual behavior and lawsuits and food sacrifice to idols and all of those things. If we're not careful, we can just look at this as like a laundry list of topics that are being addressed just to make church more fun. And so that people play nice together, which is important. But he's doing something a little bit different that we can miss. And that is the purpose of why he's doing this. And the purpose is pretty simple. Paul wants the church to think a certain way. And we're going to use a little bit of a bigger word here. He wants us to think resurrectionally, not worldly. So he doesn't want us to think of things in light of how this is in our world. He wants us to think of things resurrectionally. So all those topics, they have something to do with this thing called the resurrection that we need to understand. Or maybe another way would be he wants us to think eschatologically. Eschatology would be the things at the end of time, right? All those like end time events. He wants us to think in the end time with an end time perspective in the present time. So what does all of this look like? What is, how we behave and how we relate and how we go to court? How does that affect that is what he's writing to the church here. And so, so part of the purpose is that he wants us to think that way. And then thirdly, he also wants us to realize that the resurrection affects our life today, as well as as well as tomorrow and in the future. So there's a present aspect to the resurrection that I don't really think that most of us get. And I know for most of my years in Christianity, I really haven't thought much about it other than, you know what, I die, go to heaven, and then somehow, some way we come back and you get this cool body and you can like walk through doors and do all kind of stuff. But there's really no world because it was destroyed. And so there's a new world, but really where is a world? And there's this new Jerusalem and it's like a cube and there's, right? And you're trying to like figure all that out. And I don't think Paul is really overly interested in that. I think he's interested in how we think and the way in which we think, that we put it into our everyday actions, but we're living with an understanding that the end is very, very close and very, very near. And so this whole new way of understanding of time is what he's looking at. And he's saying it's broken into our present time because of what Jesus Christ has done on the cross and because of what he has done coming out of the grave. And there is a meaning to how it kind of works and that it does matter to us. So resurrection is a theme. We'll walk through this very quickly and then we'll kind of just look at what does this mean for us in the 21st century itself. Now, Paul was trying to repair a whole lot of things. You know, in chapters 3 or in verse 10 through 12, he's talking about like the issue of personality. Some follow Paul, some follow Peter, some follow Apollos, and he's like, yeah, and you're kind of looking at this as like, okay, who are we following? But he's looking at this in terms of just beyond simple personality problems that are in the church or division. It plays there, it works there, but he's looking at it as the individuals here in chapter 3 are people who are building something. He's building something, Peter's building something, Apollos is building something, every person at Corinth is building something, everybody who is a follower of Christ is building something. The question is, what are you building? He would say what we're building is a new temple, or we're building the church. So the way in which we build, as we said last week, and the materials that we use to build are vital. So if you use things that are like gold, silver, precious stones, you're going to find that there is an eternal kingdom benefit to that. But if you build with things that are like wood, hay, and stubble, there is a fire or a purification process that, you know, they kind of get burnt up a little bit and they're not going to last. And so he says, I want you to build with the future in sight. That's why he talks about gold, silver, and stones. I don't want you just to build with like the common building materials of today, because you're just going to build like things you're thinking that are very temporary. So don't build your kingdom. Let's build God's kingdom, and let's understand with that, because, you know, we're going to find out what are the good works and what are the rotten works later. So, you know, to think in that terms causes us then to do a couple things to go, okay, well, what am I building with? And what are we building here in the 21st century? What are you building? And what are you using to build? And what are gold and silver and precious stones? How do you relate to that? They are the things that last. So we don't look to build something by ever tearing down someone else or someone else's ministry or some other body. We don't build by saying they're wrong and we're right, because that would be the very human argument where right now in our world, everybody wants to win, right? You just want to win an argument. It doesn't really matter whether anything lasts. It's just so we win. Look at our current structure in any political system in the world. It's more important that I am in power and that I win. I'm not really seeking to do anything good for humanity. I just want to do something for me. That's pretty much a rotten work that doesn't last in the new world. Secondly, chapter 4. In judgment, go to chapter 4, because this is always a kind of an intriguing one, because this is one of those that we all know really well. In chapter 4 and verse 1, and I'll just read this to you. So this is how we should be thought of. As servants of the Messiah and household managers for God's mysteries. So all of us are supposed to think of ourselves as stewards and managers. If you ever managed anything, you kind of get a sense of what that is. You have some people that are under you, you have some things you're supposed to do. We're supposed to be in charge of the mysteries of God. What's the mystery of God? Namely that Gentiles, that everybody gets to come into this, and that there used to be just Jews and Gentiles running a parallel course. They were damned, they were headed, they were chosen, they were not chosen. Now in Christ, they're two and one. So that the New Testament talks about this mystery is what? Christ risen from the dead and two become one, and now there is this kingdom, and we manage that. That's part of what we do. And so then he goes on to say, and here's what follows. The main requirement for a manager is to be trustworthy. Having said that, I regard it as a matter of minimal concern to think that I should be interrogated by you or indeed by any human court. I don't even interrogate myself. I don't actually know of anything that stands against me, but that isn't what vindicates me. It's the Lord who interrogates me. So verse 5, don't pass judgment on anything before the time. And before the time when the Lord comes. He'll bring to light the secrets of darkness and will lay bare the intentions of the heart. Then everyone will receive praise, and that praise will come from God. So judgment, think of it long term. Don't sit there and point fingers at people before the time. God is the one who's in charge of judgment. God will handle this. And if we think with an end time mindset, if we think resurrectionally, then what we have to understand is that the people the things that we want to judge, that's in God's control. I'm supposed to be managing the message and be trustworthy for what I'm called to do, which is to take the good news, Christ has died, Christ has risen, Christ will come again message out to people, that he's a God of love, a God of hope, a God of healing, a God of restoration. I'm supposed to take that out into the dark places and be light into the dark places so that the kingdom advances and that those who are out can be those who are in. Not to sit there and go, you're out, you're out, you're out, you're out, you're out, you're out. And you know what? The sin that you commit really stinks. It's a lousy sin, so you really can't be a part of our little group here. Because if you come in and be part of our group, you're going to screw it up. Meanwhile, I don't want anyone to know that I'm one of the ones who's screwing the group up. So he said, don't do that, because what will happen is you will mistakenly think you're following so-and-so, but they're following so-and-so, and the two can never become one. So don't judge before it's time. So think forward. Third, in regards to relationships, in chapters 5, 6, and 7, what Paul wants to have the church really understand is that, look, we're part of this whole new Exodus movement of Jesus. He came to free us from the bondage of sin and death and the kingdom of Satan. He's freeing us as this kind of new Moses, but he's leading us into a new inheritance. Think in light of where we're going as this kind of new Exodus or Passover people that are going somewhere. We're going somewhere into an inheritance, is what he would say. And so it's really, really important that we understand that. So you have to see in regards to relationships how important this is. Now he's going to say something that is so important. And he talks about this part. He goes, don't you guys know, you're going to go and you're going to have a lawsuit against one another. Don't you know that you're going to be like, why are you doing that? Why are you letting a court decide? Don't you know you're going to be judging angels? I don't know about you, but I don't think about that very much. And I'm going to say that probably the church at Corinth probably would, no, I didn't know that. And why are we doing that? Because part of what we do in going into this new inheritance as God's new people is we are partners in setting to right and advancing his creation here in the earth and in the heaven and in the new creations of heaven and earth. There's something about this he wants us to think more forward than more present. He wants us to think forward, but bring it into the present so that we don't get caught up with going, okay, I'm going to court to have my rights won. And think about that, how that plays out today. In the first century, second century church, you didn't go to court. They settled that inside of the church. And the judgment that was passed was to be okay. Now that gets so twisted and so crazy in some ways, but the sense isn't that we necessarily do it, but that we think that way so that we kind of bring it back into the present. Fourth, in chapter 6, he talks about sexual behavior. And what's the, how we behave. He talks about, don't you know that your bodies are a temple of the Holy Spirit, and that you're supposed to honor God with the members of your body. So the concept is kind of interesting here. The sense is that how you behave sexually is really important, that you're very careful at who you unite your body with, both physically and spiritually. It has a high aspect of it. And when you do that out of a certain context, you dishonor your body, but you also dishonor God. So the context is this, that when you think more forward to the end time, to kind of the resurrection opens something up, we discover that God really does, in fact, place high honor on our body. So much so that he's going to make a new one for us. The question is, do we honor or realize that we honor our body maybe as much as God does? I would say probably not. And I would say Corinth obviously didn't either. And our culture surely doesn't. So what do? We think that way, then we model that way. We don't imitate that way, right? It's kind of one of those, especially when we get into the Sermon on the Mount, that's one of those things that you kind of go, ouch. I don't like that too much being touched. Fifth, in marriage and celibacy, those two areas, the argument seems to be, is one better than the other? And, when I was a singles pastor, I always used to laugh because all the singles wanted to be married, and most married people want to be single. And so you're trying to figure out how that matters, or all the married people try to be, for whatever reason, and I don't want to say all married people are miserable, but they want other single people to be part of this because misery loves company kind of a thing. So we're always pairing people up, we're always matchmaking. All the singles would go, you know what, I'm always, people are always giving me a +1, I'm always going places, or the people that view me are asking this question, is it just you, or is there somebody else? And you go, he's not talking about which one is better. He's talking about marriage and celibacy are two realities of the future kingdom. So if you think resurrectionally, what do we find at the end time happens when the kingdom of God comes down before Jesus turns it over to his Father? It's viewed as what? The church is viewed as a bride and a bridegroom, right? Kind of seen as that. Now, where does celibacy play out? When the kingdom starts and new creation starts, are we married? When Jesus was asked this by a Sadducee, he says, no, you're mistaken. You don't have to be with any of these. You're going to be like the angels. So there is no marriage, and you're not given in marriage. So the celibacy focuses on what goes forward. The marriage is between Christ and the church. Paul will use the term, it's a mystery, something that maybe you don't fully understand. It plays out here, but if we pull this back here in the present, we're going to live out our marriage here in a much better picture of what the church is going to look like when Christ comes down. Whether you're married, whether you're single, both of them play out a reality. So then the question becomes to the church, how does marriage look to the world around me? Is it really good or is it really rotten, right? And if it's really rotten, then do some things to make it really good. And if it's really good, do some things to keep it really, really great, kind of a thing. But if you don't think that way, guess what happens? Is then you live more with a worldly sense than you do with a future kingdom kind of a sense. Number 6, being in chapters 8 through 10, kind of being the people of the new Exodus. We've talked about that, but it kind of has this sense of what's it like to be a Christian in the world now in the time in which they lived. Now, the writing of this letter, somewhere in the mid to late 50s, maybe early 60s. And so he's talking to them from a standpoint of, look, it's really hard to be a Christian or a monotheist in a very polytheistic world and navigate that with all the opportunities to participate in idolatry, the worship of idols, all of that kind of stuff. It's just really, there were kids being sacrificed, all of the weird stuff that went on in those days. And that plays out today. Hard to be a follower of Jesus Christ in a world that believes any way will get you there. especially when everybody believes that all religions are all saying the same thing. So you know what, they all get us to God. And he would say, nah, no, 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 no. And there's a reason why that's not true that will get uncovered. But we need to see ourselves with a future perspective and see ourselves as the people of the future who are living in the present. And then behave like that in the present. That's the trick. It's easy to see out into the future and go, this is going to be really cool. And, as you kind of pass through heaven and, at the end times, probably the heaven experience may not be as long as people who've been died for, centuries and centuries, but the whole experience there. But then how cool is it to be all of a sudden, bang, out you come and you've got this like really cool body, dun, 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 rip your chest open and it's got like, new guy and there's no pain, there's no hair loss, there's none of that stuff in the whole new world. That goes, all the stuff that drives you crazy, that happens. And so you kind of live that way with this security as opposed to an insecurity about how we relate to people and to life. And then chapter 13 isn't just for weddings, which is the chapter on love. And he talks about, and how we love should be with a forward-looking kind of resurrectional type thought process. And chapter 13, if you're a note taker, I would say this is probably the most important point of all of what he's writing up to the resurrection and how this plays out. Because he's talking about love as something that we must embrace, that we must grow in. And I think in a worldly sense and like in a present kind of context, and I did this for the longest time, and probably to some degree still do this a lot, is you look at people and go, okay, they love better maybe than I love. Maybe I'm just, maybe that's my personality type. Maybe I don't love as much as I should or as well as I should. It's not what he's talking at all about. He's not talking about how well or how, not that there are other people that love, that maybe there aren't other people that love. He's saying, look, he'll go on at the end of the chapter, and if you remember this, when I was a child, I kind of felt like a child, I acted like a child. And I did some childish things, right? And when you're a kid, when it comes to love, what kind of childish things do? You hold your breath, you stomp your feet, you take your toys, and you go if you don't get your way, right? So if we don't grow up in all our relationships, we hold our breath, we stomp our feet, we take our shovel, our pail, our bat, and our ball, and we leave. And we break relationships. And I'm not just talking about relationships that are married. I'm talking about friendship relationships, work relationships, church relationships, all of that kind of stuff. You just go, you know what? This is horrible, and I don't want to be around these people anymore. And so, he said, I did that too. He goes, that's the nature of being a kid, is you do kid-type things, you think kid-like ways, and you ultimately act like a spoiled kid. But when I was a man, I put all of that away. When I grew up, I put all of that away. And I thought like a man. What is he saying? I came over here and I saw the resurrection. And I saw what it meant as in kind of a retrospective. Now, he's only 25, 30 years out from the resurrection when he's writing this. I kind of see now what that means. And so it's not so much about loving better or seeing people who are better lovers that do that maybe better, and there are other people who don't do it so well. He said, with a thought process that's resurrection, thinking resurrectionally, here's what I've learned about love. Love isn't so much our duty, where you kind of white knuckle it. If you ever talk to like people who are trying to like figure out their relationship, and we're just grinding. And I don't think you're supposed to grind, okay? Grinding's okay, but that's not what he's talking about. What he's talking about is love isn't so much our duty to white knuckle things, but it's our destiny. See, it's the only thing that remains, by the way. He talks about faith, hope, and love. The greatest of these is love. Why? Because it fits in the new creation. You won't need faith, and you surely won't need hope, because those will both already be answered for you in your transition from death to life. But now life after death, that's what you have. So love has to be learned because it's the language of the new creation. And so what we do is we pull that language back here in the 21st century, in the scope of time, whether you were born in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, or you're a 2000 millennial unfortunate person, and you learn how to do that in your context, right? So we're in that kind of classroom learning the language and the culture that fits over here, so that when we get it, we hit that running, that we understand it. So it isn't so much about, the worldly concept in how we love or whatever. It's something that we're learning. Now here's the problem, because that's kind of the overview. But what's the problem that Paul is facing, and what's the problem, and why is he writing? And we'll carry this on from like this week to next week, because this will take a little bit longer than the 8 minutes I have left. The problem that Paul has is this, and the problem I think that we really have, and to some degree is this, is the resurrection wasn't only not understood. So resurrection wasn't really understood, but it wasn't accepted either as an option for life after death. It's what makes Christianity phenomenally amazing, is Christianity was born into a time frame. It was birthed where resurrection had never happened or was never adhered to, was never believed in, and that's the central core, that Jesus Christ died on the cross and was buried and rose again in bodily form and was seen by a bunch of people. They're going, that can't happen. It doesn't happen because it's never happened. Therefore, it's not an option. So look what he says in the church, because the church isn't believing it either. Look at beginning in verse 12. He says, well then, if the royal proclamation of the Messiah is made on the basis that he's been raised from the dead, how can some of you say that there's no such thing as resurrection from the dead? They didn't believe it. Why didn't they believe it? Well, for a couple of reasons. Number one, they believe that at baptism, if we'll read Romans next week, they believe that when you were baptized, they didn't believe that your baptism was an identity of who you are. They believed that it was an actual life that you were lived, so that when you went down, you died with Christ, and you were raised when you came up. So they're going, well, the resurrection already exists. We already have that. Some of them believe that. And, for some, you could go, okay, you can make an argument for that, but it doesn't stand really well, because that's not really what Paul is writing about. He's talking about something completely different. So he had that group to deal with. And then he also had the group that believed that there are a ton of options out there for what happens after death. But the only option that doesn't exist is resurrection. And that's what he's addressing here, that they didn't believe it. So watch what he does in verse 13. He says, if there is no such thing as resurrection of the dead, then the Messiah hasn't been raised. Now that's kind of crazy. And if the Messiah hasn't been raised, our royal proclamation is empty, and so is your faith. We even turn out to have been misrepresenting God. It means we're lying to people, because we gave it as our evidence about God that he raised the Messiah. And if he didn't, if that is, the dead are not raised. So if Christ wasn't raised, then the dead aren't even raised. Well, if that doesn't happen, now we have a whole host of problems, because if the dead aren't raised, then the Messiah wasn't raised either. And if the Messiah wasn't raised, your faith is pointless. It's futile. You're still in your sins. Holy smokes, guess what happens? If Christ was not raised, then guess what? Then sin wasn't dealt with on the cross. Therefore, when you die, it's a crapshoot. Everything hangs and hinges and turns and is founded on the resurrection. So if it didn't happen for him, then it ain't going to happen for you. So if the 500, 600, however many people had seen him, recognized him, were taught by him, if that didn't happen, then you're not going to get a body either. Therefore, if that didn't happen, then your sin wasn't covered. If your sin wasn't covered, you're still dead. You're going to be just like Adam. One of the cool pictures, Josh and I were researching this week, and there's a painting. I forget the painter's name, but you can research it. And it's an icon. So it's a painting that's in a church, very Eastern Orthodox. where they use pictures to portray truths. And it's a picture, very famous, of Jesus. And it's Jesus Christ in his resurrected body. And he's reaching down into what's known at that point in time as the land of the dead. And he's pulling out Adam and Eve. And it's called the resurrection of the dead. And as Adam and Eve are coming up, you can see that the painter is changing their body as they're coming up. And so there's kind of like flesh and all of that kind of. Ezekiel with the whole bones, what happens, can these bones live? The understanding is that God starts with maybe bones and then kind of creates a life out of that. Not that the bones do some kind of crazy dance. I was at a play and saw that. And I figured they're trying to portray it somehow. And so so what is he saying? That, look, if none of this happened, then Jesus Christ, who we know lived and is portrayed as a great teacher with great teachings, without the resurrection, they just remain good teachings. They're no different than any other philosopher. And if that's what you're holding to, those great teachings aren't going to mean beans to your life. They're not going to do anything for you. As a matter of fact, if the resurrection did not happen, then this whole crucifixion thing just stays at what it was. Now think about this. When Jesus was born, Rome was already in control. So Rome was already crucifying people, and probably through Jesus' life, he saw multiple crucifixions. They estimate that there were well over 10,000 by the Roman military in this part of the world. So Jesus, it was really, and at no time was resurrection ever seen as anything outside of a person being shamed and the whole experience being tragic. Until Jesus Christ. Then it all changed at that moment. And so, because Jesus was raised from the dead, this gave kind of a retrospective look at the crucifixion, going, oh my gosh, he did do that. He did bring all the sum total of sin into one location. It's genius. And that location became himself, and it got put on him. So it was dealt with at one point in time, and not only was sin dealt with, but then at the resurrection, death was dealt with. So that now, as we'll find next week, this first fruit concept, he becomes the first in what everyone will look like. And we'll follow that in the same way that we right now kind of look like Adam. So Good Friday isn't supposed to be seen as a defeat. It's supposed to be seen as a victory, kind of an unbelievable victory. So, secondly, the universal belief then, when a person died, kind of was working its way into the church. Here's the universal belief that existed in the day of Corinth, that when a person died, they stayed dead. They surely never came back to life. So the understanding was in Rome and Greece and Persia, the three great kind of cultures during that period of time, is that a person would die, they would go someplace else. There was a book that you can kind of research and find and play around with. It was from Egypt. It was referred to as the Book of the Dead. The Book of the Dead was a kind of a instruction manual on what happens in the next life. And it kind of like, you go, you're kind of the shadowy kind of carbon copy issue, maybe a X-ray of yourself kind of a thing, and you live in this another land. It was referred to as the land of the dead. It was below the surface. And the one thing you could not do when you went to that land is you could never come back to this place. So Egypt believed that. Greece, in a lot of the writings, they believed in the same kind of a thing, that there would be this departure, and your body would die, and then your soul, your spirit would go to what was referred to as the land of the dead, referred to in Greece by Hades. Homer is one that writes a lot about this, and that a lot of stories about people going to the land of the dead. There's a place in Greece where you can actually go to and you kind of descend down into this underground area, and there's a gate, and it's called the Gate of the Dead, where you could actually go and you could converse with dead people, because they believed it was under the ground and you could go. People that have gone there have said, yeah, I've gone there, I went to the gate, nothing great, didn't hear any voices, didn't hear anything. It was just kind of like, wow, it's really cold down here, and I just walked a long way. So, but it does exist, and it does exist today, and you can take tours, and people take tours of it all the time. When we come to Plato, it kind of changes, because what Plato does is Plato says, okay, you live, And then when you die, the body kind of just folds away and goes back into the ground and is recycled. But the spirit and the soul, it goes on to this, not just another world, it goes into a place of what is referred to as blissful existence. And it's the best of everything. It's completely peaceful. This is where the sitting on a cloud playing the violin or the harp and all of that, that's where that comes from. It's very platonic in how it plays out. And so it's this great place that people should look forward to because it's a place of peace. And when you go there, all of the difficulties of life have been removed, and it's great, and everybody goes there. That's where a lot of what happens now, where you go to a funeral home and people go, oh, thank God he's at peace or she's at peace now. Because of this Plato-type existence of now you're dead and now it's just, and then other places have you ruling over planets and all kind of, so it all gets kind of like skewed from that point. In the days of Jesus, there was in the days of Jesus, there was the Epicureans and there was the Stoics. So there were two kind of groups of philosophers that believed in different things. The Epicureans, which find their philosophy from Epicurus, believe this, that heaven and earth are two separate realms. The realm of heaven, the gods can never come down, and they can never interact with this world because this world's evil and sinful, and divinity can't touch it. So you don't have to worry when you die because the gods and goddesses, Greek mythology, they can't come down and hurt you and they harm you and come after you. So you go into this blissful, they stay in their realm, and then for all eternity it kind of goes. And then after a certain amount of time, the world just kind of flips and turns and starts all over again. Which, you kind of go, that's pretty smart thinking. I don't know how you came about with that, but it's intriguing. And then the Stoics were like, no, that doesn't happen at all. The realms they're together. And so there is this connecting of the heavens and the earth. But here's the deal. Now watch this. The divinity's in everything. And so it's an embracement in the eternity because God's in all. God's in the grass, and God's in the trees, and God's in the moon, and God's in the river, and God's in the rain. And God's in you, and God's in you, and God's in me. And so all of this is kind of this being part of this great kind of divinity. That's like New Age, isn't it? That's where it all comes from. It all starts way back from the Stoicisms. But in none of those, and here's the whole point, just to make it light, but here's the whole point. In none of those philosophies do any of them have any place where a person has died and comes back to life on earth. Just Christianity. And Paul says, this is what makes this so incredible, is that resurrection was birthed in a world that didn't understand it or didn't believe it, and it got traction, and the whole church grew as a result of it. So it matters massively to Corinth and to us today how we live. So, a couple minutes, what does it mean? And this is where we'll kind of springboard over the next few weeks and maybe months or whatever. 3 things. Resurrection for us means that it opens up a whole new order of life. Something happened on the weekend of Good Friday to what is known as Easter Sunday, for which the world will never be the same. Something massively happened. And so one of the things that took place beyond sin being forgiven, which is great, and Jesus being raised from the dead, which is phenomenal, is it does this. It opens up a new way of us being human. And that's the Romans 6 through 1 through 6. There's this whole new way of being human as a result of what is known as our baptismal identity. That's why baptism becomes so important for the church. That's why it's an ordinance, because it speaks illustratively of the life we have. So the people in Corinth that goes, yeah, we do have resurrection life. He says, you have resurrection life, but you don't have resurrection body life. You have resurrection that's opening and drawing you towards your new inheritance where that will happen. So there's a whole new way of being human, a whole new way of loving, a whole new way of not having to sin, a whole new way of not worrying about temptation and being let out from it and being delivered and all of those things. There's a whole new way to love and to serve and all of the things that go with that. Secondly, there's a new way of fulfilling the commission or call of Christianity. You know, in Mark, Jesus talks about this in chapter 10. James and John were two guys that they were really, really concerned about being great. So they were very kind of that worldly mentality, but they were pulling their kind of their new life into that to go, you know what, this is pretty cool. This, we've watched leaders all the time lord over people. You know what happens in this? When you come into your kingdom, we're coming in with all kind of power. I'm going to rip open my chest, and everybody that gets in my way, that doesn't believe me, we're going to just and incinerate them. But what Jesus teaches is the kingdom of God is an upside-down kingdom. The kingdom of God doesn't look like this world. It doesn't function like this world. It's kind of upside down. It's topsy-turvy. So stop thinking of a worldly model of power, is what he would say to these guys. So we don't have power over people, we have people over power. So we use the newfound resurrectional power, the new power that salvation brings, the renewing of our life, to do something that the world powers don't do. We're going to serve people, not rule people. It's phenomenal, completely different. So we're going to take this gospel, we're going to take our forward-looking resurrectional mindset, and we're going to go to people with the wisdom of God and say, look, this is why your life is bad. Let me give you some good news, and then let me serve you as kind of an illustration of how that works, because I was served by Christ. And so it helps us to kind of open up and advance that. And third, there's a whole new way of doing life. You have the power to choose blessing, because God's Spirit lives in us. It's that Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 19. You can read it during the week. It's you're going into your inheritance. Israel's about to walk in. Moses has Levites on one side, Levites on another side. They're yelling down blessing, curses. This is what's going to happen if you do this. This is what happens if you do this. And at the very end of it, Moses says what? I would rather you choose life. Abundant, blessed, right, healthy, restorative, renewed life. Don't choose this, because if you choose money and power and sex and status, what you're going to find is when it's all said and done, it's just going to be a rotten life full of rotten works. And when it's time to step into the new kingdom, you're not included. So, the resurrection, it not only brings us new life, but it brings us kind of a new outlook. And it becomes this like the central part of who we are. I mean, the whole concept of, Jesus was raised from the dead, yea, us, is now Jesus is raised from the dead. I will be raised from the dead. I don't have to fear death. I don't have to fear all of this, because I know what it's coming into. And if I can somehow grasp hold of this and view the narrative this way, then I don't have to worry about figuring out, so what are the events that are going to happen when Jesus returns, so I can be prepared and I can be intrigued with it and I can blow all my friends away, and then I can scare people and saying, you know what, Jesus is going to get you. And you're going to be the group that a sword comes out of its mouth and just slaps off your head. And I'm going to be front row seat and watching it, because I've been, for the longest time, I hate you guys. That's not what that's for. And it's surely not for getting up a big chart to show all the things that are going to happen so that we can be in the know. We're supposed to be in the know so that all the things in the chart give a retrospective view of what God's doing in the future, brings it into the present so we can explain it to people so it actually sounds and looks and appears to be good news, not something on a chart that has to be memorized. And that's the thirsty world that Jesus is saying life emanates from the Father to all humanity through me. It doesn't matter. It comes to all. Now, the moment you build your life around me, the moment you come into me, you discover that I'm not only with you, but for you, and you get it all in the future. The people that die outside of me don't get the future. They get the land of the dead. So going forward, we're going to take a look at what that means, how it looks like, and then hopefully, maybe some way, we can show you how to kind of it lives out and find some things that Jesus is doing in his teaching to help us kind of grasp that and make some changes in our life. Amen? Let's stand. So here's your homework. I want you to think through the week. You know, one of the things that I think becomes really helpful is you read through 1 Corinthians 15, kind of look at that, kind of start, asking the Lord, help me to see things kind of more in a eschatological type of mind frame and a resurrectional type mind frame to see the future in the present. But what are the areas in me that maybe I need to change that Paul was talking about earlier in the letter? Is it maybe relationships? Is it idolatry? Is it sexual behavior? Is it in how I judge, or how I kind of talk about who I follow, and what am I building, and what am I building with, and what I'm doing, and the legacy and all that? What's going to outlive me, kind of a thing? What's the mark of all of this that I want to leave when my time is done? I don't want to be a white-knuckle Christian, that's just kind of hanging on for dear life going, yeah, I'm not going to recant, 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 I'm not going to recant. When is something good going to happen to me? I'm not going to recant, I'm not going to. That's not abundant life. That's rotten life. That's childish thinking. When we become adults, we see things in the future, we see our inheritance, and we kind of pull that into our present. We'll talk about how to do that at all, but I want you to think about that. There's some ways that maybe you need to think a little bit differently and kind of widen your base out. So, Father, this morning we just thank you for kind of this first step moving forward and what that means and what it looks like. Lord, it's a very difficult topic to kind of chew into a little bit and to find some understanding, but it's so important because it's the central point. Everything pivots around it. And so help us to grasp some understanding. We recognize that if any of us lacks wisdom in anything, lacks understanding, we can ask you and you'll give it to us because you want us to have it. So we're praying that over the next weeks that you enlighten us, that you'll reveal, so that as we read, we can be managers and stewards of the great mysteries of you. And one of those deals with life after death and life after death. So, Father, as we go this morning, we want to go in the abundant life. We want to go in the restored life. We want to go in the blessed life. And so I just pray that you'll bless us, that you'll keep us, that you'll cause your face to shine upon us, that you'll be gracious to us, not only today, but throughout this entire week. Help us to see what is written on the pages and help it to come